Are you serious? You can't be serious, muttered George Luckett when Reynolds told him he had just received a subpoena. I'm afraid so, mate, said the large man, his face a mask of sympathy as he took a photograph of George holding a large brown envelope. George stood on the small porch of his house, looking at the well-fed bailiff as he panted and groaned as he walked down the porch. He looked at the door of his house again. The keys were still in his hand. George muttered. Sir, there's a restraining order. You need to come with someone from the police department so you can get your things, Reynolds advised, walking forward. Damn, Samantha, huh? George shouted at the door. Sir, you've already been told about the restraining order, Reynolds said as he opened the door to his old 39-year-old Cadillac coupe. Don't make things worse, okay? George shook his head in disbelief as far as he knew. He and Samantha were happy. After all, she really conquered his world the day before he left for another 14-day shift at sea. He assumed that 14 days was enough time for someone to decide they wanted to end their marriage and file for divorce. But he could not recall anything he had done or said that would have caused his wife to file for divorce. George thought about calling his wife's cousin, Polly Chastain. But as George looked through the divorce papers, he saw that it was Polly who prepared and filed the papers. Sir, the policeman said sternly, knocking on the window of George's truck. Sir, you have been informed of the restrictive order. Wow, that's fast, George bluffed. I just said this and you're already here. No, I got a call that you violated your restraining order, Brian said Jotchet. Oh, so you're here to help me get my things? Asked George. Brian contacted the station and said he was there to help George Luke remove his personal belongings from the house. George waited patiently while the policeman reported to his station. You didn't actually call, did you? Brian grinned as he approached. No, but since you're here, George said. George was smart enough to keep his mouth shut while Samantha let in him and the policeman into the house. Disdainfully, Samantha pointed to several garbage bags and said that she had already collected all of George's things. George nodded and asked Brian, not Samantha, if he was allowed to check that she had actually packed everything he was supposed to. Officer, I'm going to get my gun from the nightstand, George said, standing in the bedroom. You don't have. Samantha began with disdain, but fell silent when George pulled out his .44 Smith & Wesson. And my rosary, my mother gave it to me when I took my first communion, George said, taking a silver rosary from Samantha's nightstand drawer. You gave it to me when we got married, Samantha countered. And now that you don't want to be a wife, I'm taking him back, George explained. George also took his 3 pillows from the bed. He then removed a large blanket from the hallway closet. My sister made it for me, George explained quietly to Brian. She was a bloody idiot, Samantha taunted George. And she called you sissy because she was so happy that she finally had a big sister, George reminded Samantha, wiping the grin off her face. Trying to check into a hotel watch out in, George found out that Samantha was busy. His cards were canceled. A check of their joint checking account revealed that the account had $100 remaining. George smiled a nervous smile at the clerk and pulled out his American Express credit card. The girl's hand trembled when she took it from his hands. George almost laughed when she exhaled. She didn't know about this card, George explained to the young lady. I used it to buy her birthday and Christmas gifts. In the room, George read the documents again. He almost choked when he read that Samantha was demanding $4,000 a month in child support, demanding full ownership of the house, while George must continue to pay the mortgage and all utilities. In return, she generously allowed George to draw all the money from his savings and checking accounts. Again, George was truly confused. There was no sign of Samantha's dissatisfaction with him or their marriage. True, she called him boring, but she had been doing that for many years. When they bought a house, Samantha wanted to buy things right away, but instead George planned every major purchase carefully. He also doubled their mortgage payments every month. It's called equity, George explained to Samantha when she wanted to put money toward their vacation account rather than their house. But Hawaii, Samantha complained. They're not going anywhere for our 10th anniversary, George assured her. It's only 3 years from now, and we'll have 3 years more money in both our holiday pay and household bills. Hawaii was amazing. Photos of the Paradise Island simply did not convey its beauty, and Samantha, his pale-skinned, red-headed beauty, looked stunning in her blue bikini. George hoped Samantha had packed his 3 Hawaiian shirts as she cleared out his side of their closet. He doubted he would ever return to the Hawaiian paradise, but he liked the loose, comfortable shirts. With a sigh, George searched his cell phone for a good lawyer. Richards, Film and Jones, they answered the call in a pleasant voice. When he heard the voice announce the name of the law firm, George felt the gravity of his situation. George sighed. The pleasant voice repeated the name of the law firm again. "I need to see a divorce lawyer," George said with difficulty. "Yes, sir," said Ethel Gerard, her voice low and soothing. Ethel took some information and assured George that a lawyer would contact him within the hour. George thanked her and finished drinking his Dr. Pepper. Again, George thought that a vending machine that sold beer would be a real bonanza. Trevor Williams, Trevor introduced himself as George answered his cell phone. I see we can meet tomorrow morning. How about 9:30? Trevor settled, and the judge ordered the money to be returned to the bank accounts. Samantha was shocked when Polly called her and threatened to quit the divorce case if Samantha committed any more shenanigans. Samantha wondered how George was able to find a lawyer she had specifically withdrawn all the money, leaving only enough for George to rent a motel room for a few nights. She canceled their credit cards before he left for 14 days at sea and reissued the cards in her name. It doesn't matter how he found a lawyer. He found one, Polly snapped. Relative or not, I won't tolerate such nonsense. Got it. Disgruntled, Samantha returned 50% of the funds to their checking and savings accounts and handed over 4 of the 8 certificates of deposit she had taken from the safe. "What about the house? Mortgage?" Samantha demanded. "He will continue to pay half until the court decides to divide the assets," Polly said. "What about electricity?" Samantha insisted. "You live there, pay your bills," sighed Polly. "You know, despite what your friends might tell you, you don't automatically get the gold mine, and he gets the bricks in a no-fault divorce. And Samantha, these abuse allegations, you better be able to back them up. The courts really, really don't like it when they are lied to or used. Do you hear?" With money in his new bank account, George rented a studio apartment in the rather pleasant Kimball area of Louisiana. The Casual was within walking distance, and Cowboy's BBQ was a 3-minute drive. The young couple who rented the apartment next to his were sociable, loud, and friendly. He worked at Kendrick's Engineering, and she worked in the shipping department at Alana's Playtime. "You work with Bowman? We do your upgrades and maintenance, you know," Foster Chalmers said proudly. "Yes, sir." George smiled as he and Foster together carried George's almost new sofa up the stairs and into his apartment. Denise Chalmers somehow managed to convince George to leave her the keys to his mailbox and spare keys to his apartment. She checked his mail and left it at his apartment. Their mailboxes were next to each other at the mail kiosk. She was offended when George asked how much it would cost. Foster offered a 6-pack of St. Beer, Elizabeth Lager, but Denise hit her husband in the buttocks. "We're neighbors. Neighbors help each other," Denise said. "Should this neighbor buy you a 6-pack of beer just because?" George suggested, seeing the disappointment on Foster's face. The next time George saw Samantha, she was visibly pregnant. She was also standing next to an arrogant-looking man wearing a very expensive suit. "And how many months are you?" George asked Samantha. "We can serve," Trevor recalled, looking at the imperturbable Samantha. "About 4 months," Samantha admitted. As the two lawyers argued back and forth, George looked at his wife. She was a real beauty, waist-length red hair, porcelain skin with a few freckles on her thin nose. Her deep brown eyes captivated George at first sight and kept him under her spell throughout the 12 years of their courtship and marriage. Samantha Chastain had 29B breasts, a 25-inch waist, and 30-inch hips, with a cute ass on her 5-foot 5-inch body. George was fascinated from the first meeting, and the glances she cast in his direction indicated that she, too, was not indifferent to George Alanluke. Working on an offshore platform made George a strong man. His clothes were tight-fitting, and Samantha was impressed by the package in front of her. "And you can dance, too," Samantha laughed happily as they twirled to the music of a Zydeco band. Now, sitting in the courtroom in St. Elizabeth's Parish, George looked again at his beautiful red-haired wife. She had that happy glow that pregnant women have, and George smiled sadly. Most likely, she would finally get those big breasts she had always complained about. Because Samantha was unable to provide evidence of the verbal and emotional abuse she alleged, the restraining order was lifted. Trevor chuckled when George whispered that he didn't want to be within 500 yards of her anyway. "Maybe it will keep you out of jail," Trevor reminded George. "It means you can go to the store without worrying that she might appear in the next aisle and start screaming that you disobeyed orders. The police tend to not believe that you didn't know she was there." "What? Why do you want this?" Samantha cried when George demanded a paternity test through Trevor. "This is not your child." "Insurance. You can't say you have better insurance through your job, huh?" asked George. But I'm already on your insurance," Samantha countered. "Oh, no, madam, you are not on it," George laughed bitterly. "I took you off her the minute you handed me the summons." "Huh? Remember, you liked my butt," Samantha said sarcastically. "No, I loved your butt. I loved all of you," George muttered to his lawyer. "Well, you probably won't get any child support," Polly hissed to Samantha. "What? Why?" Samantha demanded. "You and your genius just admitted that you had sex while you were still married to Mr. Luckett and lived with him," sighed Polly. "In the future, keep your mouth shut and leave your boyfriend at home, okay?" Before his next 14-day shift, George donated blood to Dr. Frank Roberts. The doctor smiled, assuring George that performing a DNA test during pregnancy was safe and would not harm the baby. The sample is actually taken from the amniotic fluid, not from the baby itself. Dr. Roberts informed Trevor and Polly of George's concerns. Samantha's eyes filled with tears as Polly relayed this information to her. "You know, maybe it's not too late," Polly quietly suggested to her cousin. Samantha just shook her head. She left her cousin's office and went to Moulton Park. Sitting on the swing, Samantha slowly rocked back and forth until the hot sun drove her back into the air-conditioned car. Bowman Engineering was insured through Young Insurance. William's place of work, Tri Carter, had insurance through Mutual Fidelity Insurance Group. Dr. Roger Peller accepted health plans from Young Insurance, but did not accept Mutual Fidelity. Dr. Ellen Sweetman took Mutual Fidelity, but Samantha went to the Dr. Peller ever since I married George and took out his insurance. And, having only visited Dr. Sweetman once, Samantha did not like the assembly line approach that the doctor and her staff seemed to have. William, at the next meeting, when insurance and other issues related to George and Samantha's child were discussed, began to say all sorts of nasty things trying to irritate George. "Oh my God, shut up," Polly screamed at the man. "Jesus, William." "Really?" Samantha shouted, extremely embarrassed. George smelled alcohol. He was pretty sure the smell didn't come from him or his lawyer, or Samantha and her lawyer. "Really? Well, she always said I was too big," George said calmly. "But congratulations. I'm sure it's fantastic." "Shut up," Trevor hissed, trying to hide his amusement. George chuckled as he saw William blush, while the two paralegals and the reporter couldn't hide their giggles. William shot a look of hatred at Polly as Polly ordered him to leave the conference room. After signing the documents and having them notarized, Trevor and George both visited the restroom. George was sure that he had caught some kind of virus during his shift at sea. His stomach was upset. Trevor spoke through the closed stall door and wished his client luck before leaving. Yes, I have 3 days to get rid of this, said George. While leaving the restroom, George nearly bumped into Samantha, who was leaving the women's room. George apologized and allowed Samantha to go first to the glass doors of the building. Damn, but that's a really nice ass, George said to himself as Samantha walked in front of him. As George got into his pickup truck, he saw Samantha looking around. His first thought was to shrug and leave. She filed for divorce, she evicted him from her own home. But his second thought took over, and he rolled down the window of his truck. Problems? He asked. William, we were parked right here. Samantha hesitated, pointing to the empty parking space. Where are you going? George asked, taking his cell phone out of the truck's console. I'm probably going home, Samantha admitted. Okay. Oh, how about this? Uber is on its way here, George said, looking at his phone screen. You shouldn't have done that, Samantha stammered, embarrassed. Samantha, if you were a complete stranger, I couldn't just drive away and leave you here. But you're not a stranger. You're the mother of my child, George said tenderly. Hey, how about this? Dropped off some pizza and I got a notification that you need a ride, a young man said with a smile as he pulled up in a fairly new BMW. Are you George? I'm George. That's what I told her. You're on your way, George said. Thanks. Have a nice day. Tears filled Samantha's eyes again as she watched George's truck drive out of the parking lot. She sat in the back seat of the Uber car and waited while Polly's assistant accepted several bags from Cowboy's BBQ. Damn, now I'm super hungry smelling all that food, the young man laughed. And I'm taking you to. Oh, hey, there are really nice houses in that area. Yes, they are good, Samantha agreed quietly. Denise sent Foster to George's apartment with a large bowl of chicken soup. George and Foster exchanged grins at Denise's insistence that chicken soup would cure any illness, but George ate the delicious soup. After he washed and dried the bowl, George filled it to the brim with Reese's Pieces. Denise accidentally let slip that these were her favorite candies. Foster and George both laughed as Denise squealed with delight. Although she protested that he shouldn't have done it, that she didn't need those calories. Did George know how high in calories it was? Denise was already enjoying a handful of candy. While working at sea, George used the auto-pay feature of his bank to pay all his bills. He didn't know why, but he smiled when he saw a bill from Dr. Roger among the bills. Peller. Hey, we're going to Vermilion and you're coming with us, Denise ordered as George walked in on them. Okay, George smiled, knowing that it was useless to argue with his strong-willed neighbor. Shirley Fornett is playing Do You Like It? Denise continued. She has a friend from work she wants you to meet, Foster warned George as Denise returned to the bedroom to finish getting dressed. She's not from work. I just saw her at work, Denise corrected. Tammy Hale was a real estate agent with flaming red hair and a lively personality. George liked her at first sight, and the feeling was mutual. They danced almost every dance, and when they stopped for beers, they chatted and laughed. But although they had a fun evening, both Tammy and George knew there was no spark, no real chemistry between them. They parted with a kiss on the cheek and sincere gratitude for the pleasant time spent. Denise won't calm down, Foster said, and George smiled and shrugged. Listen, I'm always working, George said, so I have a really hard time meeting women myself. See? Denise exclaimed triumphantly. So just shut up. But, Denise, no more redheads, okay? George said, showing Denise a photo of Samantha on his cell phone. Oh, well, why didn't you say anything before? Denise exclaimed, seeing that Samantha and Tammy could be sisters. Because you never asked, Foster said solemnly. You wanted to have fun, Denise said. But now. Come on, woman, I took you to dance, Foster complained as they closed the door to their apartment. The thick envelope lay on his kitchen table with other mail when George returned from a busy shift. A tropical depression threatened to become a hurricane, and as shift supervisor, George monitored the weather. He hardly slept and worried every day whether the platform should be evacuated. He was glad to step on the boat and leave the worries and stress to Greg Buckhammer, another shift supervisor. Sure, George laughed as the Weather Channel app on his phone showed the depression had subsided and then lifted in the morning. But seeing a legal declaration that his marriage was over didn't lift his spirits. George read the legal terms grimly and wondered for a moment how Samantha had felt when she received her copy of the decree. George poured himself a few sips of Iron Barrel chocolate whiskey into a small glass and drank gloomily to his failure as a husband. George was at sea when William grumbled and complained and took Samantha to St. Elizabeth's Trauma Center. After 11 hours, the last 2 of which were only Dr. Peller and a nurse helping in the delivery room, William went to the cafeteria. Samantha gave birth to Cynthia Barbara Luckett. William was outraged that the child had that bastard's last name and not his own. We're not married, why did I have to give her the last name Carter? Samantha said wearily. But isn't she beautiful? Uh-huh, William agreed, not even looking at the wrinkled and bruised creature in Samantha's arms. Cynthia had all the fingers, all the toes, deep brown eyes and flaming red hair. At 61 centimeters tall and weighing 2 kilograms, 800 grams, she was a good size and weight for a fully developed baby. George nodded in satisfaction when he received the news of his daughter's birth. Barbara was his mother's name. He wondered if good old William knew that. Cynthia was Samantha's mother's name, but it was also the name of George's beautiful, sweet, loving sister. George wondered if Samantha remembered this fact when she named her child Cynthia. George wondered if Samantha remembered Cindy's happiness when she finally had an older sister. George wondered if Samantha remembered her and Cindy's trips to the zoo to pet the animals in Lafayette at Bowl-O-Rama. George wondered if Samantha remembered holding Cindy's hand when a congenital heart defect took their special little sister from them. Returning to land, George immediately bought the Dolzrigi Andy Andrigian for her daughter. It turned out that Samantha had a new phone number. A message came that the number had been changed or was no longer valid. Not wanting to show up unannounced, George called Polly Chastain's office. Polly promised to call Samantha. Samantha called George less than 3 minutes later. She agreed that now was a good time for him to come and see the baby. George held back when he saw William's Mercedes-Benz in the open garage. The message was clear. William left the garage door open so George could see that he had been replaced by a richer, more handsome man. William grinned from behind Samantha as she opened the front door to let George into the house. Samantha smiled happily as George gave 2 dolls to the sleeping girl. He placed a couple of dolls at the foot of the crib, then sat down and simply looked in wonder at the beautiful baby. He ignored William's elaborate gestures and focused his attention on his daughter. "Oh, I almost forgot," George said and handed Samantha a small package. "This is for you." "What is this?" William demanded to know. "When she opens it, you'll see," George answered and sat down again to look at the beautiful baby. "Oh, George, this. Samantha choked up as she saw a 5 by 7-inch sterling silver photo frame with Cynthia's name and date of birth engraved at the bottom. "You put a picture of her as a child here," George said, and took a photo of Cynthia on his cell phone. "Hi, honey, it's me. Hello, it's Dad. Excuse me. She's going to call me Daddy," William stated. "Maybe," George answered easily, even as his blood began to boil. "I'm sure she'll find names for both of us." William intervened again when George politely asked Samantha for a new phone number. When she called him, only "private" was displayed on the screen. George's insistence that he only wanted the phone number because of their daughter together did not assuage William's angry claims that George did not want Samantha's phone number. "Okay," said George. "I could always call Polly, I guess." George was 3 blocks away when his phone rang. He looked and smiled. Samantha sent him her phone number with the subject line Cynthia. The day before he set sail again, Cynthia was cheerful. And, even better, William wasn't there. Being able to sit in a new rocking chair and hold his precious baby girl in his arms made George cry happily. When the baby cried for a clean diaper and some of her mother's breasts, George reluctantly gave her up. "Sorry, but you need to leave," Samantha said softly but firmly as she began to unbutton her blouse. The thought of William being allowed to see his wife, his ex-wife, breastfeeding their daughter made George's blood boil again. He nodded regretfully and left the house. However, he laughed when he saw William's Mercedes-Benz turning the corner. William will walk in, see Samantha breastfeeding Cynthia, and most likely won't believe that George wasn't allowed to witness this beautiful, simple act. He smiled widely and waved to William as their cars passed each other. Tinted windows obscured visibility, but George was sure that William did not return his friendly gesture. Trevor had to intervene when Samantha objected to George taking his daughter to his apartment. Samantha panicked as she realized she wouldn't have Cynthia in her home, in Cynthia's crib, anytime soon. She insisted on coming and checking the apartment to make sure her child would be safe. "Hello, hello, I'm your Aunt Denise. Hello." Denise Chalmers kept rambling as George carried the baby from his truck to the front door of his apartment. "George, who is it?" Samantha asked, concerned as the short, stocky woman admired her daughter enthusiastically. "Hey, Willie, do you believe Fat Saints took Jamiesa Winston?" "I know," Bryce retired, "but hey, what about Soma Hill, huh?" Foster demanded as William accompanied Samantha, looking at everything with disbelief. "Me, what?" "Hey man, it's William, okay? Not Willie," William stated, trying to impress. Reluctantly, Samantha approved of the cast-iron crib that matched the cast-iron double bed. She was not surprised that the bed was neatly made. It didn't surprise her that George had a small wash basin that he placed in the sparklingly clean bathtub when it was time to bathe his daughter. She was not surprised that there was baby soap, shampoo, and lotion in the bathroom. "And I told him to buy A&D ointment because it's the best if she gets a diaper rash." Denise showed Samantha the tube of ointment in George's medicine cabinet. "Do you use cloth diapers or disposable ones?" "Disposable," Samantha replied, still unsure about this woman they called Aunt Denise. Was all Denise said to that. Samantha discovered that William and Foster had become friends, not over their shared love of the New Orleans Saints, but over George's Iron Barrel chocolate whiskey. Stoically, Samantha held out her hand for William's car keys. "What? God, I only drank 2, 3, William declared hotly. "Foster," Denise said, making it clear to her husband that she was not at all pleased with him getting close to their neighbor's alcohol. "Man, we should buy what is this? Iron Barrel. Oh hey, chocolate. Denise, did you know that whiskey comes in different flavors?" Foster said happily, drunkenly, as Denise led him out of the apartment. "The keys, or I'll take an Uber," Samantha demanded as William staggered to his feet from George's comfortable couch. With another kiss on Cynthia's cheek, Samantha led William out to the car. George watched Samantha walk away with her beautiful ass and then closed the door. Samantha made sure that Cynthia Barbara Lucat's baptism took place on a Sunday while George was in town. At the baptism, Richard Chastain, Samantha's father, made it clear to George that he was very disappointed in his daughter's actions. Richard and George had always had a tense relationship. Richard was sure that his daughter could have married better than a worker on an oil rig. Even after George was promoted to shift supervisor, her father was convinced that she could have made better choices. But now, even though William Carter was one of the 3 founders of oil field service provider Tri-Carter, Richard wasn't so sure his daughter had made a good trade, and seeing how George flinched when Cynthia cried when water was poured on her, and William just looked bored, Richard was sure that his daughter had not made a good trade. "It's not my initiative," George defended himself as they grabbed lunch at Samantha's house after the baptism. "Yeah, I know. At least she was pretty honest about it," Richard agreed reluctantly. "This woman who calls herself Aunt Denise, is that your girlfriend?" "No, she's married to that fool in the Saints shirt," George laughed, pointing to where Foster was standing, eating hot meatballs and whistling because they were too hot. The party soon ended. Foster and Denise left. The Saints were playing the Carolina Panthers, and Foster didn't want to miss the second half of the game. Some of Samantha's colleagues from the restaurant Castle Mexican left as soon as it became clear that alcohol would not be served. "She'll call me Daddy," William said mockingly to George as he sat rocking the baby. "Oh, I'm sure she'll find a name for you," George replied, meeting William's gaze. "William," Samantha said, lips pursed. "What if she doesn't find it? I have a few suggestions," George said and grinned when Richard laughed. "George," Samantha said, her lips pursing even more. "Bye, darling, bye," George sang softly to the sleeping baby. "Daddy misses you already." "Thank you," Samantha said quietly as George placed his hand on the doorknob of his daughter's room. "The cross and chain are beautiful. I'm sure once she gets older, she'll wear them with pride." "I'm sure too," George smiled. On Monday afternoon, George was leaving the laundry room of their apartment when he saw a small girl standing in front of Denise's door. The girl had thick brown hair that almost touched the sidewalk in front of the door, although it was pulled back into a high ponytail. When she turned to see who was following her, George was struck by her clear green eyes. They usually come home around 5:30, 6, George suggested. "Oh, okay," the girl replied, now turning around completely. George saw that it was not a girl, but a very small woman. Her sweet face was small and round on her thin neck. Her torso was slender, which made her 27C breasts seem quite significant. George was sure his arms could easily wrap around her waist, and her hips looked good in the short gray skirt. George estimated that the young woman was 4 feet 10 inches tall, maybe 4 feet 11 inches. Her shoes seemed to have a 3 or 4-inch heel. "Hi, I'm George," he said, unlocking the door to his apartment. "George Luckett." "Oh, are you George? The one with the very beautiful child?" the girl exclaimed, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Yes, madam, it is me. And let me tell you, there is no one more beautiful than my Cynthia," George agreed proudly, placing his laundry basket in front of the door. George took out his phone and showed the young woman the latest photos taken at Cynthia's baptism. "Oh," the young woman sighed in admiration. "Hey, see, you met Cha-Cha," Foster said. Charlene Chalmers' face instantly turned from an admiring smile to a dissatisfied grimace. She looked first at Foster's laughing face, then at George's slightly surprised face. "And I see you've met my second favorite brother," Charlene said sharply. "How many brothers do you have?" asked George, certain that Foster only had sisters in his immediate family. "One," Charlene replied sharply. George put his underwear to the apartment, then went into the Chalmers' apartment. Foster was making coffee. George couldn't understand how Foster and Denise could drink so much caffeine and still sleep. "Foster says you work at sea?" Charlene asked. "Yes, I'm going to sea tomorrow," George replied. "That's why I wash it." "I'm an administrative assistant," Charlene said proudly. "She works right here nearby," he added Foster. His pride was obvious. "Where do you work?" George asked, thinking that the girl looked very young for an administrative assistant. "I'm with Vickers. Vickers and Dumas, they do investigations," Charlene said. "Maybe they should investigate where the rest of you are," suggested Foster. "Hey, George, maybe you noticed. She's only about 3 feet. George, do you have coffee next door?" "I'm not going to sit here until Denise gets home," Charlene said, standing up from the kitchen chair. I can make us some coffee quickly, George suggested. Hey, Foster, see if they can investigate why you're such a jerk, huh? Yes, Charlene agreed, leaving the apartment ahead of George. The coffee is almost ready, Foster countered. When Denise gets back, tell her I have your sister, George said. In his apartment, George learned that Foster's sister's name was Charlene Paula Chalmers. Due to her name Charlene Chalmers, her family gave her the unloved nickname Cha-Cha. Charlene was 19 years old and attending St. Anne Votech for administrative assistant training. The Nicole King Scholarship paid for her tuition, and she now planned to give 5% of her salary back to the Nicole King Scholarship until she paid them back. My cousin Michelle went to Louisiana State University for 4 years old and received a degree in literature, and she's an administrative assistant at St. Elizabeth's Water Works, she said Charlene, and took a sip of coffee. I like your mug. Where is Vision Island? Is it in the Gulf of Mexico? Say it a little slower, George suggested, pouring himself a mug of decaf coffee. Vision Island, Charlene said clearly. Well, even though we only met recently, I love you too, George smiled. Island. Oh, Charlene exclaimed, then laughed a cheerful, musical laugh. My idiot husband says you're here, Denise burst into the apartment. George, did you show her pictures of that beautiful baby? Of course, Charlene said, jumping down to hug her 4'11" sister-in-law. Did Foster tell you that I work right here, right at Vickers and Dumas? Lopez Square, right there, Denise clarified, pointing to a nondescript, ugly building. Uh-huh, Charlene confirmed proudly. George found himself pulled back into the Chalmers apartment while Denise prepared dinner. George decided that he would buy Charlene her own 16-ounce mug with the words Island of Visions written on it. It was easy to find out her favorite color Foster. Charlene and Denise answered this question in unison. Sometime between dinner and George finally getting out of the apartment, he promised to take Charlene to Vermilion for a dance the next time he was in town. Aunt Denise immediately volunteered herself as a nanny for Cynthia Luckett. Listen, my sister, my little sister, she's only 19, do you hear? Foster angrily said to George. And how old were we? Denise shouted at her husband. Oh my God, could you be dumber? Charlene yelled at her brother, blushing. We're going to dance. Dance. That's it, understand? When he returned from his 14-day shift, George insisted on picking up Charlene from her parents' house. He insisted on coming in and meeting Hank and Debbie Chalmers. Charlene watched in amazement as George and her overprotective father swapped stories about past hunting seasons. Both men vowed to try hunting together in the upcoming season. Sure, this one. Hey, Dad, I don't want to eat deer. Hank smacked his daughter, embarrassed. Hank, Debbie smiled, shaking her head. Dad, Charlene drawled. The Zydeco band was good, but the singer had an annoying voice. The blind guitarist sang every song through his nose, giving everything an annoying, nasal sound that didn't suit the music or his voice at all. But the band itself played fun music that you could stomp your feet to. When will you pick up Cynthia? Charlene asked as George walked her to the front door. What were you talking about sitting in that truck for the last 10 minutes? Hank opened the door sharply when Charlene stepped onto the porch. Charlene screamed. George saw a funny twinkle in Hank's eyes as Charlene screamed. George grinned at the man. We were wondering how long it would take for you to come out here and beat my ass, George replied easily. This is Mr. Hank, young man, Hank said, dragging Charlene into the house. Yes, sir, Mr. Hank, George smiled. I'm planning to take her to dinner at Sweet Pea tomorrow night. Fine. What do they have? Hank asked, chuckling as he heard his daughter complain bitterly to her mother. Does it matter? You know everything will be fine, George smiled and got into his truck. The stuffed pork chops were excellent. Charlene surprised George by managing to polish her plate, but none of them had room for dessert. By this point, Samantha had not only become accustomed to Denise's bossy personality, but also felt comfortable around the woman. On some level, Samantha decided that she and Denise were friends, so demands to show new photos of the baby were met with smiles. George was not surprised to see two women and a child on his doorstep when Samantha and Cynthia arrived at his apartment. William decided to stay in his car. Apart from drinking, William and Foster had nothing in common, and Samantha laid down the law. William was not allowed to drink in George's apartment. He nodded his head politely as George's strange neighbor waved at him in a friendly manner. Well, do you understand that? Yes, I know you got it, Samantha stammered, kissing Cynthia again. If you need anything, just call, okay? Bye, honey. Bye, Cynthia. Mommy already misses you. Bye. 5 minutes after William and Samantha pulled out of the parking lot, Charlene knocked on George's door. Hey, is she here? The baby is here, Charlene demanded, bursting into the apartment. George put on the pot of decaf coffee while Charlene squealed and fussed with the baby. He then placed his green Isle of View mug and her brand new pink Isle of View coffee mug on the table. Can I support her? Charlene asked, already holding Cynthia in her arms as she carried the baby into the living dining room. If I say no, will it do any good? George smiled. No, Charlene said, sitting on the comfortable couch. Hi, Cindy. Hi, love. Hi. George felt a pang of tears as Charlene softly sang some Cajun songs to the baby. His mother sang these songs to him, and he remembered her singing them to his sister Cindy. Even when his sister was 15, Cindy demanded that their mother sing these songs to her. Cindy would love you, George thought, looking at the beautiful 19-year-old girl holding the baby in her arms. Oh, Island of Visions, Charlene read from her mug. Love you too, I'm going to heat up some stew. Are you staying? Asked George. No, my mom makes stuffed peppers on the stove. She got the recipe from the TV show The Frying Pan. Have you watched it? Charlene asked. Mildew on? Yes, I liked that episode where he was with Gator and Rat from the children's show, George agreed. Oh, I know. I laughed when he was about to hit Gator with his frying pan, Charlene laughed. With the stem of a passionate kiss, Charlene left his apartment. George ate dinner, then dipped his baby and fed her a bottle of breast milk. He tried to remember the words to the lullabies, but most of the songs had to be sung while holding the baby in his arms. The management company placed a notice in the mailbox. George had 1 month's rent remaining. If he signs for another year, they will reduce the first month's rent by $100. If he signs for 6 months, they will reduce the first month's rent by $50. But if he decides to switch to a month-to-month lease, then their rent will increase by $25 a month. One good thing you did, Denise, George thought as he called Tammy Hale. So, what are you looking for? Tammy asked pleasantly. Denise said you have a baby. Congratulations. Looking at the Davis Realty website while he and Tammy chatted, George saw a 1-story house 3 blocks from his former place. He gave Tammy the address and MLS number. Oh, this one? Oh, yes, sir. It's for sale at a very attractive price, Tammy agreed. I can pick you up and... Tammy, if you don't have a baby car seat in the car, I'll meet you there, George insisted. Denise insisted on going with him, so Foster looked up from the sports news on ESPN, grumbling. Look, he has a nice fenced yard. You could put a swing in here, Denise said. The basketball basket is already installed, Foster noted, looking at the old board and hoop installed above the garage. You'll need a net for it, really. He'll take that ugly thing off. Yes, Denise insisted. George smiled. Well, yeah. What? Do you think Cynthia will play basketball? Denise said. Right here. This is where you should put her crib, in this room here. Charlene came the next evening and approved of the house. It was a 15-minute walk from her parents' house. It was faster if she rode a bicycle, and even faster if she drove a car. And he has a gas stove, Charlene admired. Tammy, let's start the paperwork, George said. The application was approved. First National Bank of DeGard approved George's mortgage, and Foster was supervising the loading of George's furniture when short moves arrived. Denise supervised the unloading of George's furniture and boxes into the new house. The three muscular men were professionals. They knew it was best to agree with everything the little woman said. "Thank you, madam," the foreman said as Denise gave everyone a crumpled 20 and an even more crumpled 5. "Man, you can believe that whoever is married to her definitely stays within the line," said one of the men, rushing to his next scheduled move. "My mother, she could beat you with a wooden spoon, and then 5 minutes later cook dinner with the same spoon," agreed the foreman. "These cunnas women, you shouldn't joke with them." Samantha arrived and brought Cynthia and William to George's new house. George was polite to Samantha and William. Frankly, he didn't want to see an arrogant, smirking man in his home. But George was old enough to understand that rudeness and hospitality achieve nothing. "Wow, we could walk here," Samantha remarked. "Yeah, you'll probably see us walking around here," George said, showing Samantha the new stroller he'd bought. "Yeah, no pool?" William asked mockingly, looking into the courtyard through the atrium doors. "William," Samantha said sternly. "What? Damn it. I can't say a word without making you angry," William objected. "Hey, whose car is this?" asked Charlene, entering the house. "Mine," William smiled, not taking his eyes off Charlene's impressive breasts. Given that Charlene was 14 inches shorter than William, he had to look down very far to see how her breasts stretched the boundaries of her blouse. William didn't notice the girl's irritated look. She resisted the urge to cover her chest with her hand. George, this is..." Samantha began, feeling herself tense up as her boyfriend stared at someone else's blouse like that. "Samantha, this is Charlene Chalmers," George said. "This is my girlfriend." George didn't understand why it was so hard for him to admit that the beautiful girl was his girlfriend. He assumed that part of his hesitation was due to the fact that he had difficulty accepting that Samantha was his ex-wife and not his wife. "Charlene, this is Samantha," George continued. "She's Cynthia's mom." "Yeah," Charlene said, walking up to George. "Very nice to meet you." The way Charlene squeezed George's hand told him that he would have to explain, or try to explain, that moment of hesitation in his voice when he introduced her as his girlfriend. Samantha agreed, looking at William, who continued to stare at Charlene's breasts. In Cynthia's nursery, George installed a changing table and a new low chest of drawers. Samantha wasn't surprised to see that the changing table matched Cynthia's crib. She was also not surprised by the charming lamp, a cute ballerina reaching up and holding the lampshade. This was part of what irritated Samantha so much about her husband, her ex-husband. Everything was neat and in its place. It was the same with their finances, neat, orderly, and organized. They had money, they could go to Hawaii, but George insisted that they wait. "And we had a lot more money for a lot of other things," Samantha whispered, looking at the toy box in the closet where several brand new toys were waiting for Cynthia to play with them. "Come on," Samantha suddenly demanded, grabbing William's hand. Samantha almost smiled. She could read the expression on Charlene's face. George was about to be scolded for some imaginary offense. William, as narcissistic as ever, understood the intent in Samantha's grip on his arm. He was facing yet another moral lesson for some supposed sin. He once again looked at the baby with fantastic breasts and asked Samantha if she had thought about mammoplasty. George did receive a reprimand. Charlene tearfully asked if he was ashamed of her, if he was embarrassed by her, or maybe it was that he still hadn't gotten over his divorce from his ex-wife. Was it so? Is it still warm? Does he have feelings for the beautiful redhead? George hugged and kissed Charlene and easily picked her up. Quietly, calmly, he explained the psychological obstacle he faced seeing his ex-wife and his love in the same room. "I'm your love?" Charlene asked, dissolving in his arms. While George and Charlene were making up, cuddling on his sofa, William was stretched out in Samantha's living room, eagerly awaiting his next moral lesson. He wondered if a wedding ring would help silence her. He thought about taking Samantha, without the baby's whining. God, how often babies cry. Will they ever stop filling their diapers with dirt on an Alaskan cruise and proposing to her while they were walking on a glacier? But now that that loser George had the baby to look after, it was as good a time as any to propose. "I'm leaving," Samantha said, hurrying through the living room toward the garage. "I don't know when I'll be back. You eat for dinner yourself, do you hear?" "Oh, okay," William said, standing up. "Love you." William didn't notice that Samantha didn't reciprocate. He walked over to the bar in the corner and poured himself a few sips of St. Elizabeth's premium whiskey. Assessing the weight of the bottle, William poured a few more sips into the glass. "Need to see each other," Samantha texted her cousin Polly as William drove them the 3 blocks from George's new house to their home. Polly's answer did not please Samantha. Polly and her wife were at the Casual, a small bar that the two women had chosen as their place. Samantha would have been more comfortable discussing everything in the complete privacy of Polly's office, or, even better, in Polly's beautiful and cozy home, without Whitney. Samantha didn't dislike the beautiful blonde. It was damn hard not to love bubbly, sweet, affectionate Whitney. But their sexuality made Samantha feel uncomfortable. Without Whitney's presence, Samantha could ignore Polly's life choices and pretend they didn't exist. "Hey, Terry, more diet for me, and they'll be drinking Oakleaf shots, okay?" Polly called cheerfully as Samantha entered the cozy, quiet bar. "Hooray!" Whitney laughed cheerfully, leaning her elbows on Polly. "Joe Bob, Carla is on her way. Can you hear me?" said Terry, an elderly man, addressing a very drunk customer. "Oh, damn, great. She'll see me like this," Joe Bob mumbled, lowering his head onto the bar counter. "Drink slowly," Whitney advised as Terry placed a glass of amber liquid in front of Samantha. "Oh, my God. This is delicious," Samantha exclaimed after tasting the smooth whiskey. "So, what happened?" Polly asked as she sat Samantha and Whitney down in a secluded booth. Samantha started again, stopped again, took another sip of whiskey and shook her head. Polly quietly placed her hand on Whitney's thigh, seeing that Whitney was about to help Samantha. Arrival of a tired woman with pale brown hair interrupted their conversation. They couldn't hear what the woman was saying to the drunken man, but they could sense the desperation in her voice. Yes, hell, let's go," Joe Bob barked, struggling out of his chair. After another sigh, Samantha looked at the dark wooden wall and began to speak. Quietly, she told the two women that she felt suffocated, trapped in her marriage to George Luckett. She wanted to live. She wanted fun. But George couldn't or wouldn't be spontaneous and cheerful. "He even makes the bed before he leaves the room," Samantha said irritably. "Swears he can't leave the bedroom until—" Whitney laughed and Polly playfully hit her on the arm. Samantha didn't notice the affectionate exchange between the two women, continuing to complain about George's careful planning and preparation. She then talked about meeting William when he came over for Friday night margaritas. Being an attractive red-headed woman with what many considered to be a very cute ass, Samantha was used to being approached by men, and sometimes women. Most backed down when Samantha showed them her engagement ring and the matching engagement ring. "George saved every penny he could," Samantha said quietly, looking at her bare finger. "He even worked as a painter during his free weeks." "Ah," no restrained herself Whitney sighed in admiration. "Yes," Samantha agreed quietly and tried to take another sip of excellent whiskey from the empty glass. That Friday morning, Samantha mentioned, to George that she had seen a brand new Lexus on the road. She didn't say. She wanted him. I just said that I saw him and he was very handsome. George immediately rejected the idea of her buying a new car of any make or model. Depreciation begins from the moment wheels touch the ground. Samantha now imitated George's deep voice. Samantha went to work that day in a sour mood. As the handsomely dressed William Carter, wearing an expensive suit, a large diamond ring, and a Rolex watch, was seated in her section, Samantha noticed the expensive outfit and expensive accessories. When he left, leaving a signed check with a 100% tip added, William also left his business card. Not the first time someone left their business card, Samantha muttered. But this was the first time Samantha didn't throw away the card. The Tri-Carter logo was in the upper right corner and William Carter, president of sales, was right in the center. On the back, William wrote his phone number. At first, the illicit relationship was exciting and cheerful. Then George came. For a whole week, I had to be a good, conscientious wife, do good, conscientious things, save every penny until Lincoln screamed in pain, Samantha mused. So what now? Asked Polly after a long pause. So what now? Samantha thought, looking at the tabletop. True, they didn't save a penny. If Samantha wanted cinnamon rolls, she could buy the Pillsbury brand rather than the Burns & Burns Grocers brand. She could buy glazed meat for her beef stroganoff instead of the stew meat George always insisted on. They went to the movies at regular times when most people go, not to cheap matinees. William would go to the snack stand and buy a huge buttered popcorn with extra butter. And after that, they went to the Yum Yum ice cream parlor for ice cream. George always chose one thing, either a large popcorn with a drink or ice cream after. Okay, so George is a cheapskate, said Polly. No, he's not a cheapskate, Samantha hastened to defend him. He's just too practical. William was not practical. William never thought about stocking up on Black Day. He always had a golden umbrella. Everything in their home, the home she shared with William, every item, every glass, every plate, had been bought by George. Samantha tried, but could not remember a single thing in the house that William had a hand in. Soap, Samantha said out loud. I buy soap A&A. I love raw milk and honey, Whitney gushed. It stinks, Polly joked. I'll take the blackberries, Samantha offered indifferently. More? Polly asked quietly as Samantha picked up the empty glass again. Yes, Whitney, you can have another one too, Polly laughed, and Whitney happily skipped over to the bar. You don't drink? Samantha remarked as Whitney placed 2 shot glasses on the table. Not good for the baby, Polly smiled as Whitney let out another squeal of delight. Samantha was startled when Whitney's hand rested on Polly's flat stomach. Polly put her hand on Whitney's, holding her hands on the child. Samantha took a sip of whiskey and tried to smile at her cousin and women cousins. They were both obviously thrilled about the pregnancy. William was pleased, showing off like a proud rooster in the chicken yard, until the results of George's DNA test came back showing that he, not William, was the father. I hope it's a girl. She and Cynthia can play together, Samantha said as Whitney laughed and Polly beamed with happiness. So, Samantha, what are you thinking about? Polly asked after a few moments of silence. Samantha recalled the awkward Sunday dinner at Minnie Carter's house last week. The dinner itself was delicious. Minnie's old house servant prepared it. Minnie was polite but cold to Samantha and didn't even look at Cynthia. Natalie, William's sister, had a 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Carter. Natalie was quite friendly towards Samantha. William's younger brother Andrew came with his wife, his 5-year-old daughter Rihanna and annual son Andrew Jr. for dinner. Andrew was red with cold, tough eyes. His wife Victoria was a strange sight with facial piercings and tattoos. Andrew called her Rhea, and Samantha made the alleged gaffe of calling the unusual blonde Rhea. Samantha, Honey, we're not lovers, Victoria said, her voice hard. So don't call Miria cold. Sorry. Just sorry, Samantha hesitated. And that was the end of any real conversation. Samantha's compliment on his cooking was met with a stony nod from the old servant. Samantha thanked Minnie for inviting her to her beautiful home for dinner, and Minnie simply nodded with a fake smile. From the first moment in the house, Mrs. Ole, Barbara, George's mother, dragged Samantha into the kitchen. Naturally, Cindy wanted to tag along, and the three women cooked Sunday dinner together while George and his father watched some boring football game on TV. You get out of here, Cindy ordered as George poked his head into the kitchen. It's just us girls here. Boys out. Hooray, Samantha laughed, earning herself a radiant smile from Cindy. Samantha remembered every Sunday was like this. Warmth of the kitchen lucket, the smells, the laughter, Cindy, who wanted constant confirmation from Mrs. Barbara, from Samantha. Samantha had no doubt that the next Sunday dinner at the Carter house would be just as awkward, just as uncomfortable, and after that it will be the same, constrained and uncomfortable. And William didn't notice. He was genuinely surprised when Samantha mentioned her discomfort. I think I'm seriously disappointed with the purchase, Samantha admitted to her cousin, looking away from the dark wood of the table. And, Polly prodded. And nothing. Absolutely damn nothing, Samantha said, taking the last sip of her drink. Back at home, Samantha heated up dinner from Lean Cuisine. She was not in the mood for sex, but stoically gave in to William's persuasion. William approached George and asked him to somehow look after Cynthia for 2 weeks while he took Samantha on a cruise. George organized this not for William or Samantha, but for his daughter. Samantha was almost in a panic when they boarded the ship. Previously, when George was caring for their daughter, she was only a few minutes away. But here, on the cruise ship, she was hundreds of miles away from her child. If her daughter needed her mother, Samantha would have no way to get to Cynthia quickly. "Oh my God, do you hear that? Do you hear that?" William exclaimed, stretching out on the bed in their cabin. "What?" Samantha asked, looking around. "Wow, no screaming, crying children," William laughed. At that moment, Samantha hated William Carter with all her heart. Her daughter, her precious baby, was not annoying. Her daughter was not an inconvenience. And while hiking on the glacier, William got down on one knee, holding a quadruple square diamond ring. For Samantha, it was one of the tackiest rings she had ever seen. It seemed rough. Although she was sure it was worth a lot, Samantha thought the ring looked cheap and tacky. "No," Samantha answered quietly but firmly. "Me? What? What? You've got to be kidding me," William stammered, truly shocked. "Don't make a bad situation worse, William," Samantha sighed, turning to return to the tour group. The ride back was silent. For Samantha, the return trip was more pleasant. William didn't pester her for sex, and she was one step closer to her daughter. As soon as the door to the house opened, William began to pack his things. Samantha took the keys to her car and went to pick up her daughter to bring her home. "Hey, she's almost asleep," a tired George whispered quietly as he let Samantha into his home. Samantha stood listening as Charlene sang softly to Cynthia. Samantha remembered Mrs. Barbara singing those songs to Cindy. Samantha's eyes filled with tears as she heard the familiar lullaby. "Yeah, Mommy, I think we've had a bad case of colic this week," George admitted as Charlene carried the sleeping baby out of the room. "Colic? Oh, no," Samantha cried, feeling terrible guilt for not being there to help. "Hi, Samantha," smiled a tired Charlene as she entered the kitchen. "How's it going? How's Alaska?" I didn't like it," Samantha admitted. "I'm drinking your last beer," Charlene told George. "What are you doing? Otherwise, even though I already put another one there 6, asked George. "I see you all more you buy one at a time 6 at a time," Samantha smiled softly. "Yeah, well, there's more space in the pantry," George defended. Samantha, do you want anything? Charlene suggested, unscrewing the cap from a bottle of barley turlings. How cold is this beer? Samantha asked. It should be cool by now, said George. Okay, I'll come by tomorrow. When are you leaving for the sea? Samantha asked after she stopped by to see Cynthia. Tuesday, George replied, and I'll be back in 3 weeks, not 4. I swapped with Greg for that extra week. And that's just your style, Samantha thought, almost angry at George's practical nature. No, you can't use any of your vacation days. No, you have to try to calculate all possible options for the best. God, just damn it. The house that Samantha left with William was like after a tornado. Nothing was broken, but he didn't bother to clean up after himself. The dresser drawers were half open. Clothes hangers were on the floor, on the bed. With a sigh, Samantha cleaned everything up, then vacuumed the entire house. She grinned. She did exactly what George would have done. Child support for Cynthia arrived, as always, 3 days before the due date. Due to her infidelity, Samantha did not receive child support for herself. And at that time, Samantha did not need child support for herself. She had William and his credit card in reserve. Within 2 months of William leaving, Samantha realized she was in trouble. Her modest savings have dried up. She was faced with a choice of paying her mortgage or paying her utilities and buying food. But she didn't have the funds for both. Most of Cynthia's child support went to Happyland Daycare Center, where she took her daughter when George was at sea. Dad, I need help, Samantha said. Do you need help? Do you need help? Damn, insulin tripled in price in a month, and the damn insurance company is trying to say that the tree didn't fall on the house because of a hurricane. If not because of a hurricane, then what? I pushed him into the house, her father barked into the phone. Do you need help? Join the club. George smiled happily as Samantha brought their daughter into the house. A few minutes later, Denise and Charlene arrived. Samantha burst into tears and George found himself banished to the nursery to care for his daughter while his friend and his girlfriend consoled his ex-wife. Women, huh? Said George. Oh, wait, you're one of them too, right? Damn, I'm going to have a hard time. Yeah, okay, but you promise me you'll always love me, okay? I will, Charlene said from the doorway. George, you need to come here. Tearfully admitting, Samantha said that she simply could not make a living as a waitress. The hours were long and the pay was meager. She needed all the tips, and tips were an unstable income. So what do you want from me? Asked George. Yes, madam, I'm still working. Madam, if it weren't for the Nicole King Scholarship, God, I don't know where I would be, Charlene chattered into her cell phone. George, I don't know, Samantha admitted, avoiding her ex-husband's gaze. Here, talk to this woman. Do you hear? Charlene said, handing Samantha her cell phone. Hello? Charlene? Who is it? Samantha asked. Hello, this is Kampala Jeffries. I am the current chair of the Nicole King Scholarship. Chalmers says you are an ideal candidate for our help. As you may know, any recommendations from previous scholarship recipients are moved to the top of the list, a pleasant voice said soothingly. How does 3 hours sound to you? 3 o'clock. When? What day? Samantha asked. 3 o'clock today, Miss Sluckett, Kampala laughed. Okay, go home, change into something decent. No, I'll go with you, Charlene said. See, it's God's will that I have half a day off today. After Samantha had washed her face and changed into decent clothes, Charlene instructed her, what should I say? Finally, Charlene decided that Samantha's outfit and makeup were good enough. Hello, Mrs. Jakes. Have we arrived at Kampala? Charlene turned to receptionists as they entered the lobby of King Sanitation. You are Miss Sluckett, Sheila Jakes smiled. I'll let Mrs. Jeffries know you're here. Charlene, how are you doing? She'll see you now, Sheila said to Samantha after a moment. This. I'll take her. I know where it is, Charlene said, taking Samantha's hand and pulling hair through the hall. Charlene, hello? The attractive African-American woman smiled, standing up. You are pregnant? Charlene exclaimed, noticing the woman's small belly. An hour later, George looked up as a beaming Charlene entered his house. He got up and started preparing dinner. She's going into vocational tech. Can you imagine? She thinks she can become an administrative assistant like me, Charlene continued. Should I be worried? Are you spending time with my ex-wife? George joked. Hey, we're both Cynthia's moms, Charlene defended. We need to get along for the sake of the baby. George was surprised when Samantha burst into the house calling for Charlene. Charlene left George in the kitchen. Samantha handed over a brochure from St. Elizabeth's Professional Tech and excitedly showed Charlene that one of the courses was child care. He and Charlene sat on George's sofa and viewed other possibilities. And I broke into your house like that. Beth, you'd put a bullet in my ass, George thought as he prepared the hash browns that Charlene liked so much. Do you have enough? Charlene asked, and George smiled. Yes, I have enough, he said. Sorry, Samantha said as they sat down to eat. I know, if you broke into my house, I'd be more than a little upset. But I was just so excited when I saw childcare and... We have a doorbell, George said calmly. And next time I'll use it, Samantha promised. How do you always do it so perfectly? Asked Charlene. Potatoes? It adds cream, Samantha replied. Cynthia screamed and George waved for both women to remain seated. A moment later, he was carrying the baby into the kitchen and rummaging through the refrigerator for a bottle for her. I can feed her, Samantha suggested, reaching for the buttons of her blouse. Oh, sure, George said, handing Cynthia over to Samantha. George tried not to look. George tried not to get excited watching his ex-wife breastfeed their child. Charlene looked at his reddened face and lightly punched his arm. So when do you start? George asked as Samantha buttoned her blouse. Oh, not this Monday, but next Monday, Samantha replied. I have to let them know my choice by this Friday so they can make sure there's room. Well, I'm sure you'll do great, George said, clearing the dishes from the table. I hope so, Samantha said, losing some of her enthusiasm. Remember, I went to ULD for one semester, got 3 Fs and 1 D. Yeah, what did your dad say? Was too busy having fun to study, George agreed. Anyone need a diaper change? Huh? Who needs a dry diaper? Charlene spoke caringly as she took Cynthia from Samantha. George was at the sink when he felt his ex-wife's arms wrap around his waist. He felt her hug him from behind, pressing his head to her shoulder. I'm sorry, Samantha whispered. It's okay. Just ring the doorbell next time, okay? Said George. No, am not for that, Samantha said quietly, releasing him. HM, George asked, turning slightly to look over his shoulder at her. For all of this, for everything, Samantha sobbed, then quickly left George's house. George wrung out the sponge and placed it on the small wire tray at the back of the sink. He heard Samantha's car drive away. George heard Charlene singing to Cynthia as she carried the girl from the kitchen into the living room. Yes, I'm sorry too, George said, and I'm not sorry. As George entered the living room, Charlene looked up from her place on the sofa. The warm, happy smile she gave George made George smile back. He locked the front door of his house and sat down on the sofa. Wow, Charlene giggled as George easily lifted her and Cynthia onto his lap. George could smell Charlene's sweat. He could smell the laundry detergent Debbie Chalmers used. It was the same profitable brand he used. So, Samantha, I'm not one bit sorry, George thought, looking at Charlene. When I knew I had half a day, Charlene said. And you spent it on my ex-wife, George teased, tilting his head to kiss her. Uh-huh, George. Charlene carried Cynthia into her nursery, kissed the baby tenderly, and then placed the baby in her crib. The next day, Hank and George met at the dead end for meatloaf with a choice of red or brown gravy. A very cute strawberry blonde was jumping and twirling to some hip-hop tune, and Hank and George agreed that the music had changed since Chet Atkins died. And you know, the girl has no idea who Chet Atkins is. Hank nodded his head as the girl stepped out of her faux leopard print top. Probably not, George agreed, wondering what Charlene would look like in a leopard print top and matching miniskirt. After Hank happily gave George his blessing to ask for his baby's hand in marriage, Hank generously picked up the bill for lunch. Hank shrugged when George reluctantly broke the news that he couldn't get married in the Catholic Church. He was a divorcee. Shit, it doesn't matter. We are Lutherans. Larry Elgin, Atonement Lutheran right here. He'll marry you all, Hank said cheerfully. When the two men left the bar, Hank was already on the phone telling Debbie the good news. Hank and George warned Debbie to keep the good news to herself. Charlene didn't know about the ring in George's pocket. No, Samantha, I'm not sorry, George thought as he stopped in front of his old house to pick up Cynthia. Hey, I was going to call you, Samantha winced, already dressed in her Casa Ol waitress uniform. Billy just called Monica, just got up, left. Okay, George agreed and wrinkled his nose at the squalor of his former home. The place needed a good cleaning and vacuuming. This kitchen counter hadn't been cleaned since this morning George saw the frying pan Samantha had used to cook bacon and eggs. Yes, George, I know. The place is a wreck, Samantha spat as George led Cynthia to the door. But you know what? You don't live here. I live. You don't live here anymore, George. No, Samantha, I'm not sorry at all, George smiled as he buckled Cynthia into her car seat. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one, then 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 compared to the next one, then